October 1944, the first night at Camp Algona, Iowa. 12 German women prisoners huddled together in their new barracks, listening to every footstep outside, every voice in the darkness. They'd been warned, told in explicit detail what would happen to captured women in enemy hands. The propaganda had been clear, relentless, terrifying. "They will show you no mercy," their officers had said. "They are brutal, dangerous, without honor." So the women waited in the darkness, hearts pounding, fearing the worst. Young Liesel Wagner, only 19, gripped the hand of the woman beside her. Greta Hoffmann, the schoolteacher who'd become their unofficial leader, stood by the door, ready to protect the others. The night stretched ahead of them like an eternity. But what actually happened in that Iowa prisoner camp over the next weeks and months would shatter everything they'd been taught to believe. Subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the truth hidden beneath wartime propaganda. To understand the terror these women felt, you need to understand Nazi propaganda. For 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, German civilians and soldiers had been bombarded with stories about Allied brutality. Posters showed American soldiers as savage criminals. Radio broadcasts described in graphic detail what supposedly happened to German prisoners, especially women, in enemy hands. Newsreels fabricated atrocity stories designed to make Germans fight harder, resist longer, fear surrender more than death itself. The message was consistent and relentless. Capture meant suffering. For women, capture meant something even worse. Greta Hoffmann had seen these posters plastered on walls in Hamburg. She'd heard the radio broadcasts. She'd watched friends and neighbors absorb these messages until fear became fact in their minds. Now, sitting in an American prisoner camp, she was about to discover whether any of it was true. And the 12 women with her, the youngest, only 19, the oldest 41, were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war isn't a bullet or a bomb. It's a lie repeated until everyone believes it. November 1944. The transport train had delivered 14 German women prisoners to Camp Algona just as the Iowa sun was setting, casting long shadows across the flat Midwestern landscape. Elsa Zimmermann, 27 years old, a schoolteacher from Hamburg, had been designated their leader by default. She spoke the best English among them, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing unruly classrooms. But nothing in her teaching career had prepared her for this responsibility. The women had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the Allied advance through occupied France. Most were auxiliaries clerks, radio operators, nurses, non-combatants who'd been swept up in the chaos of Germany's collapsing Western Front. The youngest among them was Frieda Becker, barely 18, a timid girl from Munich who'd been working as a secretary when conscription notices arrived. The oldest was Helga Richter, 33, a practical woman from Berlin whose sharp eyes missed nothing. American soldiers had processed them efficiently upon arrival: photographs, fingerprints, identification cards with prisoner numbers. The guards had been professional, distant but not cruel. They'd been assigned to a newly constructed barracks separate from the main camp that housed thousands of German men. The building smelled of fresh pine lumber and held 14 narrow beds arranged in 2 rows, a small stove for heating, and windows that looked out onto empty prairie. "They separated us from the men," Ingrid Weber observed quietly as they entered the barracks for the first time. At 31, the nurse had seen enough field hospitals to recognize isolation when she saw it. That could be good, or it could be very bad. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone. Isolation meant privacy for whatever might happen. No witnesses, no protection from the male prisoners who might have at least provided the illusion of safety in numbers. As darkness fell, the 14 women made their preparations. Some changed into the plain gray prison dresses they'd been issued. Others kept their traveling clothes on, not wanting to be vulnerable. Frieda Becker sat on her assigned bunk, clutching a small photograph of her mother, tears streaming silently down her young face. "Put that away," Helga Richter said, not unkindly. "Don't give them anything they can use against you. No weakness, no emotion, nothing." Elsa Zimmermann moved through the barracks, checking on each woman, offering what comfort she could, though she felt none herself. Her own heart was hammering so hard she thought the others must hear it. She'd positioned her bunk closest to the single door, the only entrance to the barracks. If someone came through it with bad intentions, she would be first. It was the only protection she could offer. "What do we do if they come?" Frida whispered, her voice breaking. "We survive," Elsa said firmly, with more confidence than she felt. "We survive together. That's all we can do." Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. Every woman in the barracks froze. The footsteps came closer, then stopped just outside the door. Elsa's breath caught in her throat. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. A knock, gentle, almost tentative. Then a voice, older, gravelly, speaking English with a Midwestern accent. "Ladies, this is Sergeant Brennan. I'm the night watch supervisor. Just wanted to let you know I'll be making rounds every hour. If you need anything, blankets, water, anything at all, there's a bell by the door you can ring. Otherwise, I'll stay out of your way. Good night." Footsteps retreated. Silence. The 14 women stared at each other in the dim light from the single overhead bulb. Elsa's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He'd knocked, announced himself, offered help, then left, without entering, without demanding anything, without even opening the door. Was that a trick? Ingrid Weber asked quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. Some kind of test to see if we'd respond. Helga Richter shook her head slowly, her practical mind working through possibilities. If they wanted to trick us, they wouldn't knock. They wouldn't announce themselves. They would just come in. "Maybe they're waiting," Frida whispered, fresh tears starting. "Waiting until we think we're safe, and then—" "Enough," Elsa said firmly, though her own hands were shaking. "We don't know anything yet. We wait, we watch, we stay together." The first hour crawled by like a year. Every sound made them jump. A door closing somewhere in the camp, voices from the guards' barracks in the distance, the wind picking up across the Iowa plains, rattling the new windows. Through it all, they sat on their bunks, rigid with tension, waiting for something to happen. Exactly 1 hour later, footsteps approached again. The same measured pace. Sergeant Robert Brennan, 54 years old, making his promised rounds. This time he didn't knock, didn't speak. Just walked past their barracks, his boots crunching on gravel, then continued on to check other buildings. His route took him past their window, and several women caught a glimpse of him in the moonlight, an older man with gray hair, moving with the careful gait of someone whose knees weren't what they used to be. Hour 2. The same routine. Footsteps approaching, passing, retreating. Nothing threatening, nothing dangerous, just a guard doing his job. By hour 3, exhaustion was beginning to override fear. Several of the women had started to doze despite themselves, their bodies demanding rest, even as their minds screamed warnings. Frida had finally stopped crying, curled up on her bunk with her photograph tucked under her pillow. Ingrid had taken off her shoes, a small act of trust that felt enormous in the circumstances. Elsa remained awake, positioned by the door, watching and waiting. Her mind kept circling back to the propaganda she'd absorbed over 6 years of war. The posters in Hamburg showing American soldiers with cruel faces and grasping hands. The radio broadcasts describing in explicit detail what happened to captured women. The newsreels showing staged atrocities designed to make every German believe that surrender was worse than death. But Sergeant Brennan had knocked on the door, had offered blankets, had kept his distance. Dawn came slowly to Iowa in November, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale gold. The 14 women had made it through their first night. Nothing had happened. The realization settled over them gradually, bringing with it confusion that was almost as unsettling as the fear had been. Breakfast arrived at 7 in the morning, delivered by a different guard. A younger man who kept his eyes respectfully averted and set the food trays just inside the door without entering the barracks. Bread, some kind of cereal, weak coffee. Simple food, but more than they'd seen in weeks of transport and holding camps. "Thank you," Elsa said automatically in English, the words coming out before she could stop them. The young guard looked surprised, then offered a small nod. "You're welcome, ma'am. More coffee if you need it. Just ring the bell." He left quickly, pulling the door closed behind him. Ma'am, he'd called her ma'am, not prisoner, not German, not any of the terms she'd expected. Ma'am, like she was a person deserving of basic courtesy. The second day followed the same pattern, meals delivered with respect, Sergeant Brennan making his rounds at precise intervals, always announcing his presence, never entering without permission. When one of the women needed to use the bathroom facilities in a separate building, a female staff member from the camp administrative office escorted them, providing privacy and protection from the male guards. By the third day, the initial terror had faded into wary confusion. By the fifth day, some women were starting to sleep through the night. By day 7, they'd established routines: wake at dawn, breakfast, assigned work duties that kept them busy, dinner, evening in the barracks, lights out at 10. And through it all, not one threatening moment, not one cruel word, not one instance of the brutality they'd been promised to expect. Private Daniel Crawford was assigned to their work detail during the second week. 23 years old, fresh-faced from somewhere called Nebraska, he supervised as the women sorted and repaired military uniforms in a workshop building. He was awkward around them at first, clearly uncomfortable with the language barrier and uncertain how to interact with enemy prisoners who happened to be women. "Morning, ma'am," he'd say to Elsa each day, the same greeting he probably used with his mother back home. The women would nod silently, still uncertain how to respond to courtesy from someone they had been taught to fear. But Crawford never pushed for conversation. He simply showed them their tasks, made sure they had adequate materials, and kept a respectful distance while they worked. On the 9th day, something small but significant happened. Frida Becker, the youngest, had been struggling with a particularly stubborn seam on a torn jacket. Her needle broke, and she made a small sound of frustration. Crawford looked up from his paperwork, saw the problem, and without a word, retrieved a new needle from the supply cabinet. "Here," he said, holding it out. "These army jackets are tough. Needles break all the time." Frida hesitated, her 18-year-old face showing the internal conflict. Take the needle and interact with an American soldier, or struggle without help to maintain distance? Finally, necessity won. She reached out and accepted the needle, her fingers barely brushing his hand before she pulled back. "Thank you," she whispered in heavily accented English. Crawford smiled, a genuine friendly expression that reached his eyes. "You're welcome, miss. Let me know if you need anything else." That evening, in the privacy of their barracks, Frida described the interaction to the others. "He smiled at me," she said, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. "Not in a mean way, not in a dangerous way, just a normal smile, like I was a person." "You are a person," Helga Richter said sharply. But even she looked troubled. If the Americans saw them as people, if they treated them with basic human decency, what did that mean about everything they had been told? The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. 6 years of propaganda insisted that Americans were brutal, dangerous, without honor. But 2 weeks of actual experience showed something entirely different: respectful guards, adequate food, safe sleeping quarters, work assignments that were tedious but not cruel. And most disturbing of all, the word "ma'am," repeated so often it had lost its shock value and become simply how they were addressed. Thomas Mitchell, the camp cook, was 41 years old and had the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working in hot kitchens. Unlike many of the guards, he spoke to the women regularly when they picked up meal trays from the kitchen building. He'd ask if the food was acceptable, if anyone had dietary restrictions he should know about, if the portions were sufficient. "Any of you ladies vegetarian?" he asked on day 11, his tone purely practical. "I can make adjustments if needed. Just want to make sure everyone's getting proper nutrition." Elsa, translating for those whose English was weaker, found herself stumbling over the words. The concept that an American cook in a prison camp would care about their dietary preferences, their nutrition, their individual needs, it didn't fit anywhere in the framework she'd been given. "No," she managed finally. "No vegetarians, but thank you for asking." Mitchell nodded. "Good to know. You let me know if that changes, or if anyone has allergies or anything. Can't have you getting sick on my watch." After he'd gone, Ingrid Weber spoke quietly. "I've worked in 3 field hospitals during this war. I've seen how our own medical staff treated injured soldiers, German soldiers, our own people. Some of those doctors showed less concern for their patients than that American cook just showed for us." The statement hung in the air, dangerous and undeniable. Speaking it aloud felt like treason, but it was also simply true. Week 3 brought another shift. The weather had turned colder, proper Iowa winter settling in. The women's barracks had adequate heating from the small stove, but their issued clothing was thin. They'd been prepared for France's mild climate, not the American Midwest in November. Without being asked, additional blankets appeared on their bunks, warmer socks, even 2 heavy coats that someone had sourced from storage, meant to be shared among them for trips between buildings. "Who authorized this?" Elsa asked Sergeant Brennan during one of his evening rounds, genuinely confused. The older man looked at her with something like surprise. "Camp commander did, ma'am. Saw you ladies were cold. Can't have prisoners getting frostbite or pneumonia. Geneva Convention requires adequate provisions for health and safety." Geneva Convention. Elsa knew the term vaguely international agreements about treatment of prisoners, but she'd assumed those were just papers, words that meant nothing in actual practice. Yet here was evidence that the Americans were following those rules, treating those guidelines as actual requirements rather than suggestions. That night, Elsa lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling of the barracks. 3 weeks had passed, 21 days of waiting for the brutality that propaganda had promised, 21 days of respectful treatment instead. The disconnect was creating cracks in the foundation of everything she thought she knew. She thought about her students back in Hamburg, children she'd taught history and literature before the war consumed everything. She'd stood in front of those classrooms and repeated what she'd been told to teach, about German superiority, about the dangers of foreign enemies, about why the war was necessary and just. Had she been lying to those children? Or had she simply been repeating lies she'd believed herself? The 4th week brought an unexpected test of the developing trust. Private Crawford arrived at the work detail one morning looking troubled. He cleared his throat several times before speaking, clearly uncomfortable. "Ladies, I need to inform you that we'll have a new supervisor starting tomorrow. I'm being transferred to different duties." He paused, then added quickly, "The new supervisor is Corporal Martin. He's fair, professional. You'll be fine." There was something in Crawford's tone, a subtle warning wrapped in reassurance. The women exchanged glances, tension immediately rising. A new supervisor meant new uncertainty. What if this Corporal Martin wasn't like Crawford? What if he was the brutal American they'd been warned about? The next morning, they met Corporal James Martin, and within 5 minutes, Elsa understood Crawford's careful warning. Martin was indeed professional, but he was also cold, efficient, and clearly uncomfortable with women prisoners. He gave instructions without meeting their eyes, stayed as far from them as the room allowed, and spoke in clipped sentences that discouraged any interaction. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He was simply doing his job with minimal engagement. For the women, this shift was oddly clarifying. Crawford's warmth hadn't been standard American behavior. It had been his personal character. Martin's distance showed that Americans were individuals, not a monolithic group. Some were naturally kind. Some were professionally distant. But even Martin, with his obvious discomfort, never threatened them, never raised his voice, never violated the boundaries of proper conduct. "It's strange," Helga Richter observed during lunch on Martin's 3rd day supervising them. "Even the one who clearly doesn't like us still treats us correctly, like there are rules he follows even when he'd rather not." "Maybe that's what civilization means," Ingrid said thoughtfully. "Not that everyone is kind, but that even those who aren't kind still follow certain standards of behavior." Week 5 brought an incident that would cement the women's changing understanding. A fight broke out in the main camp between German prisoners, some political argument that turned physical. American guards intervened immediately, separating the combatants and providing medical attention to both injured men. The 14 women watched through their barracks window as one of the fighters, bleeding from a cut above his eye, was escorted past their building toward the infirmary. The American guard, walking with him, had a hand on his arm, not roughly restraining him, but guiding him, almost supporting him. The prisoner was enemy, had been fighting, was bleeding and angry, and the American guard was helping him walk. "In the camps I worked," Ingrid said quietly, still watching through the window. "When prisoners fought, the guards would beat both of them as punishment, sometimes badly. I saw men die from those beatings. She turned from the window, her face pale. That guard is taking that German soldier to get medical care, like it matters that he's hurt, like, enemy or not, bleeding requires treatment. Prowl. That evening, Elsa made a decision that frightened her with its implications. When Sergeant Brennan made his rounds, she stepped outside the barracks to speak with him directly, the first time any of them had voluntarily initiated conversation with a guard. "Sergeant, may I ask you something?" Brennan stopped, surprised but not alarmed. "Of course, ma'am. What do you need?" Elsa struggled to find words in English adequate for what she wanted to know. "The men who fought today, they are being punished? They'll spend a few days in isolation, yes, have to maintain order, but they'll be fed, given medical attention if needed, standard disciplinary procedures. Not beaten?" The word came out small, uncertain. Brennan's weathered face showed something between sadness and understanding. "No, ma'am, we don't beat prisoners. That's not how we do things here." Elsa nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "Thank you, Sergeant." She turned to go back inside, then paused. "May I ask, why?" "Why what, ma'am? Why do you treat us this way? We are German. We are your enemy. Why?" She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate the enormity of what she was asking. Why the respect? Why the decency? Why the contradiction of everything she'd been taught? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold November air. "Because you're prisoners of war under our protection, ma'am. That comes with responsibilities. We follow rules, international law, but more than that." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Most of us have mothers, sisters, daughters back home. We'd want them treated with dignity if positions were reversed. Golden rule, I suppose. Treat others how you'd want your own family treated." He nodded respectfully and continued his rounds, leaving Elsa standing in the cold, her mind reeling. The golden rule. She knew it from childhood religious instruction, before the war, before the propaganda. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Such a simple concept, and the Americans were actually following it. Inside the barracks, she found all 13 women awake and waiting, having heard the conversation through the thin walls. "He said they follow rules even for enemies," Frida said, her young voice filled with wonder. "He said they think about their own families and treat us how they'd want their families treated." 6 years, Helga Richter said suddenly, her usually controlled voice breaking. 6 years they told us Americans were monsters, barbarians, dangerous, and it was all lies, all of it. She stood abruptly, pacing the narrow space between bunks. What else did they lie about? What else have we believed that isn't true? The question opened floodgates. Women who'd been silent for weeks began talking, questioning, examining memories through new lenses. Stories they'd been told about Allied atrocities, now suspect. Justifications for the war, now doubtful. The entire narrative of German righteousness versus Allied evil, crumbling under the weight of daily evidence to the contrary. "My brother is still fighting," one woman said, her voice choked, "on the Eastern Front. He believes what we believed. That surrender means death or worse. What if he dies fighting because of lies? What if he's already dead because he was too afraid to surrender?" "My father worked in the propaganda ministry," another admitted, something she'd never shared before. "I thought he was important, doing necessary work. Now I wonder if he knew. If he knew it was all lies and he spread them anyway." The conversation continued deep into the night, painful and necessary. They were grieving, not for people lost, but for years of false beliefs, for trust betrayed, for the comfortable certainty of propaganda replaced by the uncomfortable complexity of truth. Week 6 brought the breaking point. Frida Becker, the youngest at 18, had been growing quieter each day, retreating into herself. On the morning of day 37, she didn't get out of bed when the wake-up call came. Just lay there, facing the wall, her shoulders shaking. Elsa knelt beside her bunk. "Frida, what's wrong? Are you ill?" The girl turned over, her young face blotchy from crying. "I can't stop thinking about it," she sobbed. "Everything they told me, everything I believed, my teachers, my parents, everyone I trusted, they all lied, or they believed lies, and taught me to believe them too. How do I trust anything now? How do I know what's real?" It was the question they were all struggling with, but hearing it from someone so young made it more heartbreaking. Frida had barely begun her adult life when the war started. She'd spent her entire coming of age believing falsehoods, shaped by propaganda during the years when identity and worldview form. Ingrid sat on the other side of the bunk taking Frida's hand. You trust what you see with your own eyes now. Not what you were told, but what you experience. These Americans have shown us who they are through their actions. That's real. That's truth. We can verify ourselves. But for 6 years I trusted what I was told, Frida wept. I was so certain, so sure I knew what was right and true, and I was completely wrong. So how do I trust even my own judgment now? Elsa had no easy answer. The truth was, she struggled with the same crisis of faith in her own judgment. She'd been older than Frida when the war started, supposedly wiser, more educated. Yet she'd believed the same lies. Perhaps education and intelligence meant nothing when an entire society conspired to make falsehood seem like truth. That afternoon, Thomas Mitchell noticed Frida's red eyes and subdued demeanor during meal service. The cook said nothing at first, just served the food as usual. But as the women were leaving, he called out quietly, "Miss Becker, could you wait a moment, please?" Frida froze, fear flashing across her face, old instinct still suggesting that being singled out by authority meant danger. But Elsa nodded encouragement, and Frida approached the serving window cautiously. Mitchell pulled out a small wrapped package from under the counter. "My daughter's about your age. She sent me some cookies from home last week. Too many for one person. Thought maybe you could use something sweet." He pushed the package toward her. No strings attached, just cookies. Everyone needs something to smile about sometimes. Frida stared at the package, then at Mitchell, then burst into fresh tears. But these were different tears, not despair, but the overwhelming confusion of unexpected kindness from a source she'd been taught to fear. She accepted the cookies with trembling hands, whispered, "Danke, thank you," and fled back to the barracks. That small gesture catalyzed something in all of them. The Americans weren't pretending to be decent while waiting to show their true nature. This was their true nature. Individual humans, some warmer than others, but operating within a system that required respectful treatment of prisoners regardless of personal feelings. 2 months after their arrival, new prisoners came to Camp Algona 8, more German women captured in the continuing Allied advance. They were processed and brought to the barracks late one evening, terrified and traumatized. The 14 veteran prisoners recognized that fear immediately. They'd felt it themselves just 8 weeks earlier. "They're going to," one of the newcomers began in rapid German, too panicked to complete the thought. "No," Elsa said firmly, stepping forward. "No, they're not. Nothing is going to happen to you. You're safe here." "But the propaganda said—" "The propaganda lied," Helga Richter interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won truth. "About everything, about who Americans are, about how prisoners are treated, about all of it. We were told the same lies you were. We believed them too, and we were wrong." Over the next hours, the veteran prisoners shared their experiences, the respectful guards, the adequate food, the medical care, the blankets when it got cold, the word ma'am used consistently, the absence of all the horrors they'd been promised to expect. The newcomers listened with expressions cycling through disbelief, suspicion, confusion, and finally, tentative hope. Watching them process the same revelations she'd experienced, Elsa understood something profound. Every German prisoner who came through this camp would go through the same transformation. Terror giving way to confusion, giving way to reluctant acceptance of reality. Each one would have to confront the lies they'd believed. Each one would have to rebuild their understanding of enemies, of truth, of whom to trust. In late January, permission came through for the prisoners to write letters home. The women gathered around the barracks table with Red Cross stationery, struggling to find words that could convey what they'd learned. How do you tell family members still living under Nazi rule that everything they believe is false? How do you say, "The enemy treats me better than I expected," without implying criticism of your own country that censors would flag? Elsa wrote to her sister in Hamburg, choosing words carefully. "The Americans follow rules about prisoner treatment very strictly. We are adequately fed and housed. The guards are professional and proper. I am safe and well." Bland words that said nothing and everything. Her sister would read between the lines, would understand that professional and proper meant not the monsters we were told about. Frida's letter to her mother was more emotional. I think about you every day and pray you are safe. The world is not what we were taught it was. I am learning that sometimes the hardest thing is not surviving difficulty, but surviving the discovery that what you believed was wrong. I love you and miss you. Helga wrote to her sister with characteristic bluntness. You asked in your last letter before I was captured whether I was afraid of being taken prisoner. I was terrified. Everything we heard suggested capture meant suffering. But I am treated according to international law, food, shelter, medical care when needed. It makes me wonder what else we were told that wasn't true. Think about that, sister. Think carefully. When Sergeant Brennan collected their letters for processing, he glanced at Elsa's. His weathered face showed understanding. He knew what it meant that these women were writing home about being treated well. Evidence that contradicted years of propaganda, spreading through letters one family at a time. These will go through, ma'am, he said quietly. Truth has a way of getting out, even in wartime. 3 months into their captivity, Private Crawford returned to supervise their work detail. He'd completed his temporary assignment and requested to return to working with the women prisoners. On his first day back, he brought news. The war's not going well for Germany, he said carefully, knowing this information was both painful and necessary. The Allies are pushing forward on both fronts. It's probably going to be over in the next few months. The women absorbed this in silence. They'd known, of course. You couldn't be captured and transported across an ocean without understanding that your side was losing, but hearing it stated plainly made it real. What happens to us? Ingrid asked. When it ends, you'll be repatriated eventually, sent home. Might take time to process everyone, but you'll go back to Germany. He paused, then added gently, to whatever's left of it. That night, the women talked about what home might look like now. Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Elsa knew her neighborhood was likely rubble. Berlin had been targeted for years. Munich, Frankfurt, every major city had suffered. They would return to a country destroyed, defeated, forced to confront not just physical devastation, but the moral devastation of what their government had done. At least we'll return, knowing one true thing, Elsa said quietly. We'll know that the Americans weren't the monsters. We'll know that respect and decency exist even between enemies. That's something we can build from. Will anyone believe us? Frida wondered, when we tell them how we were treated. Some will, Helga said. Some won't, but we'll know. And that changes everything. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. News reached Camp Algona on a spring morning when the Iowa prairie was green and alive. The German prisoners, both the women and the thousands of men in the main camp, received the information with complex emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, grief for their destroyed homeland, uncertainty about the future. That evening, Thomas Mitchell prepared a simple meal but served it with unusual care. The women noticed he'd added small touches. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, real butter instead of margarine, even some early strawberries from somewhere. Figured everyone could use something good today, he explained when Elsa thanked him. War's over, that's worth acknowledging, even for the losing side. Even for the losing side. That phrase captured something essential about how these Americans had treated them all along. Enemies, yes. Defeated, yes. But still people deserving of basic dignity. Months would pass before repatriation began. When it finally came time to leave, Elsa stood outside the barracks one last time with Sergeant Brennan on his final round. Thank you, she said simply, in English that had improved dramatically over 9 months. For treating us like human beings, for showing us that propaganda lied, for giving us something to believe in when everything else was broken. Brennan nodded, his old eyes understanding. You take care of yourself, ma'am. And when you get home, you tell people what you saw here. Truth matters, especially after years of lies. The women returned to a Germany none of them recognized. Cities in ruins, government collapsed, society shattered. But they carried with them a lesson learned in an Iowa prisoner camp. That enemies could show respect. That humanity persisted even in war. That propaganda's greatest weakness was the truth of lived experience. Years later, some of them would tell their stories. To children, to grandchildren, to anyone willing to listen. About the night they waited in terror for brutality that never came. About the guards who said ma'am and meant it. About the cook who shared cookies with a crying girl. About how respect destroyed 6 years of lies and 8 weeks of reality. And they would end those stories the same way Elsa always did. Remember this. Remember that what you're told about enemies might be wrong. That propaganda makes monsters of ordinary people. That the hardest thing we ever did wasn't surviving the war. It was surviving the discovery that everything we believed was a lie. And the most important thing we learned was that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than comfortable lies. If you found this story moving, please subscribe for more untold moments from history that reveal our shared humanity. These stories matter because they show us that even in humanity's darkest hours, decency can persist. That respect can bridge seemingly impossible divides. That sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is simply treating people with dignity. Leave a comment about what surprised you most, and I'll see you in the next story.